Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really digging into a piece of history that often gets, well, overlooked. It's about this quiet transformation, something that arguably helped shape, post-war Europe as we know it. Our mission today is to get granular, look really closely at the experience of German prisoners of war. We're talking fiercely loyal Nazi soldiers shipped in huge numbers, not back to Europe, but right into the heartland of the United States.
Yeah, it's an amazing story, really. A total paradox when you think about it. You've got these captured soldiers, right? Many from the Afrika Korps, battle-hardened guys, steeped in intense Nazi propaganda. It's 1943. They've been told over and over that America is, well, weak, chaotic, racially impure. Basically a decadent society about to collapse.
Right, so they're expecting maybe brutality or at least a country just barely holding on. And instead, bam, they land in the arsenal of democracy. So this physical journey, moving hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers into, 500 camps across 46 states, it kind of accidentally becomes this incredibly effective re-education program.
Exactly. And our sources really detail this multi-layered process. It fundamentally changed how these men saw the world, their ideology. We're going to trace that journey through sort of four key stages. First, the immediate shock, seeing American industry, American abundance, that just shattered their confidence in the war. Then the unexpected humanity inside the POW camps, the intellectual freedom even. Third, how all this created this cognitive dissonance, this internal conflict that started dismantling Nazi beliefs. And finally, the legacy, what these guys took back with them to a Germany in ruins.
It's fascinating because it wasn't just about surviving captivity. It was more like an ideological surrender.
Yeah.
But based on what they were actually seeing.
Oh.
Okay, let's unpack this. The whole transformation process kicks off pretty much the second they arrive on American soil. So to really get this, you first have to understand the mindset, right? These men truly believed in the German war machine. They believed in the technical superiority, the racial ideology. I mean, Germany had been winning for years. So when they're captured, they're expecting America to be struggling, rationing, kind of like Germany was back home.
Oh, absolutely. Their expectations were shaped by total war in Europe.
Yeah.
Back in Germany, everything was marshaled for the war. Strict rationing, blackouts, cities getting bombed, gasoline for civilians, almost non-existent. The supply chain was constantly under pressure. They knew the cost of war firsthand.
So, yeah, imagine the disconnect. The ships dock, and they're not seeing scarcity. They're seeing abundance, unstoppable motion. The sources really emphasize how stunned they were by just the initial sights.
It was a sensory overload almost, not just physical, but everything they saw, heard, felt. They talk about seeing factories, just endless factories, humming 24/7, non-stop production. And farmland, huge stretches of it, unrationed, seemingly limitless food supply right there.
And the cities, that detail always gets me. They describe American cities glowing with light. I mean, think about it. They've lived under strict mandatory blackouts for years, driven by fear. Seeing a fully lit city, maybe even neon signs, it must have seemed either incredibly decadent or just a sign of unimaginable wealth and power. It instantly, blew up the propaganda about America running out of energy.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the lights. It was the sheer volume of stuff, everyday consumption. Diaries mention seeing so much civilian traffic. Trucks, sure, but also private cars, lots of them, all running on gasoline that clearly wasn't being rationed like it was back home. To a German soldier used to every drop of fuel going to the military, this just suggested a resource pool they couldn't even fathom, let alone compete with.
And that visual evidence then connects directly to the hard reality of American industrial power. This wasn't just passive wealth. It was wealth being actively converted into war machinery at a speed that was just terrifying, relentless.
Yeah.
This is where that initial shock goes from just being impressive to being, existentially dreadful for them.
Right. And the sources give us that killer statistic, the one that must have really hit home, especially for the engineers and mechanics among the POWs. The U.S. was producing a B-24 Liberator bomber, a huge complex aircraft, every 63 minutes.
63 minutes for a 4-engine heavy bomber. So,
Yeah.
I mean, you could watch a movie in that time and a whole warplane rolls off the line. It's staggering. What did that specific number mean to a German soldier thinking about the war?
It meant the war was lost. Simple as that. German industry, especially under the Nazis, it was focused on high quality, often custom engineering. Very skilled labor, but slower. America was just pure Fordism, mass production, assembly lines, sheer volume. The POWs suddenly saw that they weren't just fighting against time. Time was actively working against them. Every hour, the enemy got stronger. Exponentially stronger.
So that one data point just flipped the whole script in their minds. There's that quote from one POW's diary, right?
Yeah.
Captures it perfectly. We were told America was struggling, but here, everything moved like clockwork. We could see power in motion. He wasn't just impressed, he understood. Game over.
Exactly. It wasn't just an army they were fighting, it was an entire industrial civilization. A civilization that could take hits, absorb losses, and just produce replacements faster than Germany could inflict damage. The whole German strategy relied on outlasting the Allies, bleeding them dry. This first-hand view showed them that core premise was totally wrong. And realizing your own leadership got it that wrong, that must have been a huge psychological blow.
Yeah, this overwhelming power, it must have demanded respect. But in their ideology, respect usually came with brutality, didn't it? And here's where it gets really interesting, like you said, because the shock of American power was immediately followed by the shock of American humanity. And that combination, that seems to be what created the perfect storm for changing minds.
Well, first, just the scale of this operation. Housing Axis POWs. It was immense. Between 43 and 46, you're talking over 400,000 enemy soldiers brought to the U.S., which led to, what, over 500 POW camps spread all across the country, deep inside America, Utah, Arizona, the Midwest, everywhere.
And these camps were run, apparently, quite strictly according to the Geneva Convention, which was, partly strategic, sure, but also maybe reflected something about American values. And it was definitely not what many prisoners expected, especially given how their own regime treated captives.
Absolutely. Adhering to the Geneva Convention meant way more than just keeping them alive. They got fair food, often better than what regular American civilians were getting with wartime rationing, believe it or not. Proper medical care. And crucially, they kept their right to an intellectual life. Access to education, books, libraries, even musical instruments.
And almost sounds surreal, like some kind of bizarre academic retreat, not a wartime prison camp. We're not just talking basic needs met. The sources suggest a real cultural and intellectual life, actually, sort of blossomed in these places.
It did. Think about it. They suddenly had time on their hands. Mandatory leisure time, in a way. And that's dangerous for a totalitarian ideology that relies on keeping people busy and fed propaganda. So, yeah, camps set up small libraries, sometimes run by the prisoners themselves. They held debates, lectures, formed orchestras, put on plays at sports leagues. They had the time, and maybe for the first time in years, the mental space to think critically, something the Nazi system actively suppressed.
I wonder, though, was this universally accepted? Surely there were hardline Nazis who just saw this kindness as weakness, right? As decadent.
Yeah.
Did they try to, maintain control within the camps? Cause trouble?
Oh, definitely. That's a really important point. The U.S. Army figured out pretty quickly they had an internal problem. You had your die-hard SS members, your fanatical Hitler Youth types. They sometimes called them the black shirts inside the camps. And these guys were intimidating, sometimes even attacking or killing other prisoners who seemed too moderate or anti-Nazi or friendly towards the Americans.
Wow. So how did the U.S. authorities handle that, having, internal Nazi enforcers inside their POW camps?
They got smart about it. They started a systematic segregation program. They actively identified the hardliners, the really dangerous fanatics, and moved them. Sent them off to more isolated high-security camps, places like Camp Concordia in Kansas or Camp Ruston down in Louisiana. And then the more receptive prisoners, the anti-Nazis, or just the guys who wanted to survive and maybe learn something, they were often grouped together in camps specifically designed to encourage education. This separation was key. It created safe spaces where guys could actually engage with new ideas without fearing a beating or worse from their own side.
That makes sense. That's a crucial detail. It wasn't just kindness. It was managed kindness, allowing space for change. But what about outside the wire? The interactions with local Americans, that must have been controversial.
Initially, huge hostility, you can imagine. People were asking, why are we treating our enemies so well when our boys are overseas fighting and dying? Makes sense. But, necessity plays a role. So many local American men were away fighting. So POWs were often put to work, especially on farms. Agriculture needed labor badly. And that forced interaction.
And over time, that interaction changed things, like seeing them work, maybe hearing them play music. The sources mention prisoners' orchestras sometimes playing for local churches or events.
Exactly. The abstraction of the enemy started to break down. When a German POW helps you bring in your harvest, or you hear him play the cello beautifully, well, it gets harder to see him just as a faceless Nazi monster. They started seeing each other as well as people, not just uniforms or ideologies. So that humane treatment, it worked because it was a lived reality. It directly contradicted the Nazi propaganda that painted enemies as subhuman.
It forced that internal reckoning, didn't it? If these supposedly decadent Americans follow rules like the Geneva Convention, treat enemies fairly, maybe the whole Nazi worldview is built on lies,
Yeah.
which sets the stage perfectly for the next phase, the actual ideological shift. So you've got this constant exposure, American life, the freedom, the wealth, the basic humanity, and that relentless industrial power. It all starts to chip away systematically at the Nazi ideology these prisoners held so deeply.
Yeah.
It wasn't just realizing they were losing the war anymore. It was realizing they might have been fighting for the wrong thing entirely.
Yeah, the sources really point to intense cognitive dissonance, that internal clash of ideas. I mean, these men were raised to believe in a rigid, male-dominated, racially pure dictatorship as the only path to strength. And then American society throws all this contradictory evidence at them, constantly. Evidence that strength could actually come from the very things they were taught to despise. Freedom, diversity, you know?
Right. Let's drill down on those specific things they saw. What really challenged those core beliefs about racial superiority and dictatorship?
Well, the workforce was a big one, a visual shock. Seeing black and white Americans working together side by side on the same factory floors, assembling the very tanks and planes beating them, and then seeing women. Women operating heavy machinery, driving trucks, running farms efficiently. This just flew in the face of the Nazi ideal of Kinder, Kusha, Kirsche. You know, women belong with children, in the kitchen, at church.
So their ideology preached that only a racially pure, male-run society could be truly strong and efficient. Yet here they are, captives in a diverse, mixed-gender society that's massively outproducing and outfighting them. For a lot of them, sources say, this was their first real glimpse of democracy in action, not just as a theory, but as a system that worked, that built things, that won wars.
And the diaries, the secret diaries they kept, they show this internal struggle so clearly. They're trying to make sense of it. You see entries like, "We were taught that democracy is weak, but here democracy builds tanks." It's so direct. The evidence that B-24 every 63 minutes just demolishes a core Nazi belief right there.
And then it deepens, right? Moves from the purely military or industrial to the philosophical. That next step seems to be the question recorded by several POWs. I began to wonder, how could such a free people be so strong? That's the pivot point, isn't it? The realization that maybe the strength wasn't despite the freedom and diversity, but somehow because of it. That the things they were taught were weaknesses were actually sources of American power.
Exactly. And that personal observational shift, that laid the groundwork for what turned out to be this incredibly successful, if largely unintentional at first, re-education program. Successful because it tapped into the prisoners' own observations and questions.
Okay, now let's talk about those camps that really leaned into education, the ones with the camp colleges. What were they actually teaching these guys?
The curriculum seems pretty targeted. They offered classes in American history, civics, how democracy works, human rights, the English language, obviously. They used American textbooks. And this is interesting. The classes were often taught by other anti-Nazi German prisoners or maybe German-speaking academics who'd fled the Nazis and were hired by the U.S. Army. That probably helped, keeping the instruction culturally familiar, you know?
But the sources really hammer home one key point about this education. It was offered, not forced. Why was that distinction, that element of choice, so critical for it to actually work, to dismantle an ideology?
Yeah, that seems to have been crucial. The U.S. military, or at least the people running this program, understood something important: forced indoctrination. That's just more propaganda. And these guys were experts in seeing through propaganda by then, or at least resisting it. If you force someone to learn something, especially something that challenges their core beliefs, they'll just dig their heels in, right? But by making it voluntary, they let the prisoners choose to seek answers. Answers to that big question nagging at them. How can these free people be so strong?
It shifts the dynamic. The prisoner isn't just a captive being lectured. He becomes a student actively looking for understanding. They were kind of empowered to think for themselves, maybe for the first time in a long time. The only real freedom they had left was the freedom to read, to learn, to choose what to believe.
And that choice, that agency, made all the difference. When they chose to go to a class on American history or read about the Constitution, it connected directly with what they were seeing around them. The well-run camps, the industrial might outside the fences. They weren't being forced. They were convincing themselves based on evidence and voluntary learning. It's like the U.S. defeated Nazism in their minds, not by shouting louder, but by just demonstrating a better, more successful way of life and letting them study it.
So the war ends, and this huge process of sending hundreds of thousands of POWs back to Germany starts up, 45, 46. The record suggests their departure wasn't just relief at going home. There was something else. They left America changed, grateful, even emotional.
Yeah, you have to picture the contrast. They weren't just leaving a POW camp. In many ways, they were leaving the most stable, predictable, well-fed environment they'd known in years. And they were going back to, well, utter devastation. Germany was physically shattered, morally bankrupt. But, crucially, they carried something back with them. This vision, the sources call it, of what a rebuilt Germany could become. A vision based directly on the strength, the freedom, the sheer functional capacity they'd witnessed firsthand in the U.S.
And there's that striking statistic that really backs up this idea of a fundamental change happening, the escape rate. The sources say only 0.6%, less than 1% of German POWs in America ever even tried to escape. That's incredibly low for prisoners of war.
It really is, and it suggests something profound, doesn't it? It suggests that for most of these men, the desire to escape wasn't just about physical freedom. Maybe they'd already found a different kind of freedom, freedom from the lies of the Nazi ideology. I mean, if you've fundamentally concluded that the system you fought for was wrong, built on falsehoods, destined to fail, why rush back to the ruins of that system? Maybe it made more sense to stay, learn, and prepare yourself mentally to build something better when you eventually did go home.
And that preparation, that learning, it paid off massively when they did get back. These returnees, they became absolutely vital figures in building the new West Germany. They were the ones with the practical knowledge.
Think about their unique position. They were Germans, they understood the culture, but they were also educated, organized, and crucially, they'd seen a successful democracy work up close. So yeah, they stepped into key roles, they became teachers, passing on democratic ideas, they became journalists, helping shape a free press, they became diplomats, rebuilding bridges. They were perfectly placed to guide the reconstruction and align the new Federal Republic with the West.
And the sources give us that incredible example, Walter Hallstein. Can you trace that line for us? From POW camp to, essentially, the architect of modern Europe.
It's an amazing trajectory. Hallstein was a law professor captured by the Americans. While he was a POW, he got deeply involved in the educational programs, studying civics, American constitutional law, democratic theory. He goes back to Germany, helps found the Christian Democratic Union, the CDU, the party that basically defined post-war West Germany under Adenauer. And then, the big one, he becomes the very first president of the Commission of the European Economic Community, the EEC, the direct forerunner of today's European Union.
Wow. So the ideas he grappled with voluntarily in an American POW camp, cooperation, democracy, shared governance, they didn't just stay theoretical. They became part of the actual blueprint for the EU. That's a direct, tangible impact.
It really underscores that central theme, doesn't it? That America's victory wasn't just military, it was also ideological, achieved by turning enemies into allies, fundamentally, through mercy instead of hatred, as one source puts it. It wasn't just about strategy, it was about the power of a positive example. You could argue the successful democratization of West Germany, its strong alliance with the West, was partly seated right there in those POW camps on American soil.
So what's the big takeaway here for us looking back? It really seems to prove that the power of example, the power of belief in your own values, might be the strongest foreign policy tool there is. Believing in democracy, fairness, basic human decency. It wasn't just the nice thing to do during the war. It was actually a hugely effective long-term strategic move that helped secure the peace afterward. Hashtag tag out outro.
So just to wrap up the key points for you listening, you had that initial industrial shock, right? Shattering the myth of American weakness. Then the humane treatment under the Geneva Convention, providing this undeniable lived proof of a moral code that contradicted Nazi propaganda. And then crucially, that voluntary education piece, allowing these men to choose to understand and internalize democratic values rather than having them forced down their throats.
It really is an incredible story. And yeah, the source is framing this as one of the quietest yet greatest victories of World War II. It makes sense. America didn't just beat Nazism with bombs and bullets. It also beat it with belief. Belief in its own system, which it confidently let its enemies see up close, leading to this intellectual conversion for so many.
Which leaves us with a big question, really. A question that still resonates today in all sorts of conflicts. Where does real lasting strength come from? Is it from repression, forced loyalty like the Nazis believed? Or does it come from transparency, sticking to your values even with enemies and, effectively using all your human potential freely? The story of these POWs and the success of West Germany afterwards seems to point pretty strongly towards the latter.
Absolutely. And thank you for bringing us the sources that let us do this deep dive. It's a powerful reminder about how you win the peace, not just the war. Winning hearts and minds. For real.
And maybe a final thought for you to chew on. If this approach using humanity, positive example, intellectual freedom, instead of just retribution or more propaganda worked so effectively back then, transforming thousands of soldiers from a totalitarian state, how might that model apply today? When dealing with ideological opponents, when does demonstrating the success and integrity of your own system become your most potent weapon? That's the quiet lesson, maybe, that we need to remember.